as a neuroscientist, how specifically do some of the neurotransmitters like dopamine interact with testosterone or other hormones? Like, they're basically, it's just a different name, like they're both chemicals, right? Neurotransmitters and hormones are just kind of operating in different areas. So how do these things all interact?
Yeah.
I know that's a broad question, but have at it.
Oh, yeah, that's really cool, actually, because one thing is a lot of people, they tend to just use testosterone, or not testosterone, hormone when they mean neurotransmitter, and vice versa, right? So there are a couple of differences, right? So the main difference is that a neurotransmitter interacts with a neuron on a very molecular level. So it's like microns, right? A micron is a very, it's like less than a nanometer, right? So that is how neurotransmitters are actually processing within the brain, right? As well as in the gut, other parts of the body. Neurotransmitters are not just in the brain, right? But the difference is that a hormone travels long distances normally, right? So whereas a neurotransmitter, it's released from the presynaptic terminal for all the advanced guys, and then it travels to the postsynaptic terminal, and that is how the neurons are communicating with each other. But then a hormone is not so much in terms of proximity, right? So for example, when you think of the release of testosterone, right? So testosterone is produced in the testes, right? In Leydig cells of the testes. But the way it works is there is a hormone, which is luteinizing hormone, LH, that is released by the pituitary gland in the brain, and it travels all the way through your blood to the testes, to the Leydig cells, and that triggers the production of testosterone in the Leydig cells. So whereas hormones take a long time to actually get to where they need to be, neurotransmitters are happening within microseconds, milliseconds. So that's the biggest difference between a neurotransmitter and a hormone. But then there's hormones like oxytocin that are both neurotransmitters and hormones. Right, so that's how they're interacting. Now, you asked about the interplay of these hormones. That's an interesting question too. So there's multiple ways that these hormones interact. So one specific topic is just in the brain, right? So if you look at, for example, prolactin, right? For a lot of listeners out there who are fathers, or they might, they might not be fathers, but they have a long-term relationship. What tends to happen is, especially when a baby is born, a father has an increase in prolactin levels, okay? Now, the thing with prolactin is it tends to decrease testosterone levels, right? Now, this is very practical for our guys because, if you're listening there and you're a father, you might have been more let's just say promiscuous, or more, you would be more attracted to a female when you saw her, right? Because now you have higher libido and so on. But then when you become a father, there's an increase in prolactin levels, and that tends to decrease testosterone levels, right? Now, the interplay between these two has a lot to do with dopamine, right? So specifically what happens is dopamine has an inhibitory effect on what triggers prolactin levels, okay? So there's something known as a prolactin-releasing hormone that is released by the hypothalamus. And so what dopamine does is inhibits that process, and in turn increases testosterone levels, because now prolactin is no longer able to decrease testosterone. So that is how these guys are interacting from a libido perspective, or a sex drive perspective. So that's one way to look at it.
Okay, very excellent. I've also heard testosterone described as a neurohormone. Does it play a role specifically in the brain and the nervous system beyond many of the other effects that people associate testosterone to?
Yeah, absolutely, man. So it's really cool, right? So testosterone is also known as an androgen, right? There's other androgens as well, but testosterone is the main one. And the way testosterone works, be it in the brain or be it anywhere else in the body, is by binding to androgen receptors. So there are androgen receptors also in the brain, right? Now, the reason it's known as a neurohormone is because, well, obviously is interacting in the brain, so that's where the neural comes from, and it's the hormone because it is traveling in the blood to actually do those whatever benefits that it's providing, whatever functions it's providing, right? So obviously testosterone is involved in a myriad of functions. So whichever function that is, it is acting as a hormone. Now, the reason it is sometimes looked at as a sort of like a transmitter or something that is happening in a neuron is because it is affecting a neuron by interacting with its nucleus, right? So you have to think of receptors as there are different types of receptors, right? So some receptors are extracellular. They are located outside the cell, right? So for example, a dopamine receptor, like a D2 receptor, right? That's the receptor that people associate with, for example, like porn addiction and all the your brain on porn stuff is all about D2, because they found that the D2 receptor is what is responsible for different types of addictions, not necessarily porn specifically, but all types of addictions. So that receptor is outside the cell. It's extracellular. But the way the androgen receptor works is that it's inside the cell. So when testosterone diffuses inside a neuron, it has to bind to this androgen receptor, which is going to interact with the genetic factors which are inside the nucleus, right? So it's actually going to interact with the DNA of that cell, right? So it's known as a transcription factor because it will enable transcription, translation, protein synthesis, and then eventually gene expression. Now, why is that important? Because gene expression is what allows someone to actually have a phenotype, right? So for example, if you think of hair growth, right? So one way testosterone works is it binds to androgen receptors on certain types of hair follicles, right? So for example, a beard, right? So the reason we have a beard is because there's androgen receptors that are on the follicles of those hairs, right? And there are different types of follicles. There's vellus and terminal and different types of follicles, and some get, some stay for life. Some, like for example, male pattern baldness, they don't stay for life, right? So that's also androgen dependent, right? So then that's again testosterone binding to androgen receptors, causing male pattern baldness, right? So that is how this is the interplay of why people think of testosterone as actually sort of like a transmitter, because it is going inside the cell. It is acting on the molecular and genetic expression of the cell.
Fascinating. I've never heard it described in those terms. That's excellent. Excellent. Speaking of the hair loss or the hair,